Press freedom under attack, journalists harassed and killed. But isn't information a public good? So how can reliable information be accessed? On World Press Day, this is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Hashem. Ahelbarra. Attacks on journalists are on the rise and becoming more obvious and open around the world. The International Press Institute, or IPI, has recorded 635 violations globally and says at least 49 journalists were killed in the past year. The main offenders are authoritarian leaders who are increasingly emboldened in their crackdown on the media. They almost never face justice for their efforts to silence journalists. IPI says the pandemic is accelerating those negative trends as governments use the public health crisis to restrict press freedom. And it warns new censorship rules could become the permanent norm. The organization's executive director, Barbara Triumfi, said the rise in open attacks on press freedom and the targeting of journalists in dictatorial and illiberal-minded regimes around the world is an ominous sign for the future of democratic freedoms. Press freedom is under assault everywhere we look, with tactics and methods for doing so being shared and copied by governments. Anti-democratic regimes increasingly feel that they can silence the media with impunity. This has a domino effect, encouraging other states to follow suit. The International Press Institute says India has committed press freedom violations more than any other country in the world, with 84 offences. Afghanistan had the greatest number of targeted killings against journalists, with 9 cases. Myanmar, China, the Philippines, Belarus and Hungary are among the countries cracking down on media. And an alarming number of physical and verbal attacks on journalists were reported in Europe during the pandemic. So-called fake news laws that provide governments with control over the flow of information were introduced in at least 18 jurisdictions. Let's bring in our guest in Paris. Pauline Ades-Mevel is editor-in-chief and spokeswoman at the Reporters Without Borders. In Hong Kong, Tom Grundy, editor-in-chief and founder of the Hong Kong Free Press, an independent publication. In Doha, Mohamed Elmasry, chair of journalism program at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Welcome to the program. Pauline, how do you explain the rise in attacks, threats targeting journalists worldwide?
This year, with the pandemic, we've seen a number of increase. We've seen a big increase on the attacks on journalists. Of course, due to the pandemic, it's extremely worrying, and we have released very shortly, our last index on press freedom, which shows that 73% of the countries RSF monitors throughout the world have now have put some have blocked in different ways the information and journalists to do their job. So it's worrying.
Tom, how do journalists operate in Hong Kong against the backdrop of the security law that was introduced in last year?
Well, journalists have been scrambling to react to that law, which is vaguely worded. It's being broadly applied, and I would say is having a chilling effect probably in every newsroom. We're not getting straight answers when we seek to work out how to deal with this, such as can we interview this person, can we film that? It appears this law is designed purposefully to make the media self-censor and overcorrect. We've already seen a newsroom raided, its proprietor arrested. So I would say we're in the midst of a full-throated crackdown, and to be honest, we've all got whiplash from the speed of what's going on.
Mohamed, for decades, the general sentiment was basically that there are areas which are safe for journalists to operate, others, usually, historically speaking, we're talking about Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and parts of Latin America, which were widely seen as unsafe. But those lines seem to be now more and more blurred.
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, I think we have to note that governments everywhere, in democratic societies and also in non-democratic societies, have an interest in trying to control media narratives. And journalists are often seen as troublemakers and rabble-rousers. But it has become increasingly difficult for journalists to navigate their spaces. But it's always been difficult. Just a couple of weeks ago in Minneapolis, where I'm from, journalists were targeted by police when they were covering or trying to cover the Derek Chauvin trial. Of course, Derek Chauvin being the officer who killed George Floyd. So it's a problem, obviously, everywhere, but it's more of an acute problem in non-democratic societies.
Pauline, Afghanistan is the country with the greatest number of targeted killings of journalists. How do you see the situation evolving, particularly that there's now a growing sense of uncertainty of the future?
Well, with the uncertainty of the pandemic, of course, we are worried about what's going on. I think it's very important that organizations like ours continue to denounce the measures that have been put in place by several countries during the pandemic to block journalists, to prevent journalists to do their job on the field, especially those measures that have been taken during the first lockdown at the beginning of 2020. The other thing is that we have to make sure also that in countries where there were restrictions, they have now disappeared, and journalists can work in better ways. They cannot be under such curfew or lockdown for so long, and it is important that this situation which have been implemented are not left in place for too long. The other thing, and it is probably the most worrying thing right now for us, is the spread of disinformation that has really increased with this pandemic in the past year. It is very important that all together we fight to express to the international audience, public, what information is and what information it brings, especially at the time of a pandemic.
Tom, the security law you spoke about, it's vaguely worded clauses, and there are some paragraphs which talk about trials that are going to be heard behind closed doors and some cases which are going to be tried in mainland China. Is this an indication that we're talking about the end of an era, the beginning of a new era for journalists operating in Hong Kong?
Well, Hong Kong was always a bastion of press freedom within Asia, and I think there are certainly worse places to be journalists even now, certainly safety-wise, but I don't know where else in the world you can point to where you have seen such a rapid sense of going from a free and open society with all of these guarantees on which this newsroom was built, with free expression, press freedom, to this authoritarian atmosphere we have now, where indeed figures like Jimmy Lai of the pro-democracy Apple Daily could be facing trial on the mainland. You can have warrantless raids under the security law, hand-picked judges, court cases behind closed doors. So, the rule of law is certainly under fire because it's just so unpredictable as to whether you're going to, step on a landmine just doing your daily job.
Mohamed, in places like Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and different parts of the Middle East, we're talking about the same pattern which has been going on for quite some time. Journalists targeted, a campaign of discrimination, threats. It's a very dire situation for those people.
Well, there's no question. I mean, and when we talk about the Middle East, or when we talk specifically about the Arab region, I do think we have to be careful to differentiate between and among countries. I try to resist the temptation to treat the Arab world as a monolith. Clearly, it isn't. There are places where there are comparatively greater levels of freedom, places like Tunisia, Kuwait, Lebanon. And obviously, in Qatar, we have Al Jazeera. So we don't want to treat those places like some of the others that you mentioned. Obviously, the situation in Syria is extremely dire. The situation in Yemen. We can look to a country like Egypt, which is one of the countries that I focus on in my own research. And Egypt took a step forward, during the Arab Spring, or in the immediate aftermath of the uprising in 2011, and then it took several steps backwards.
Pauline, we were talking about those concerns expressed by different international reports, the International Press Institute, but what is quite striking this time is that it's also happening in Europe, with the case of Daphne Caruana Galizia, Jan Kuciak, Yorgos Karaivas. It's really an alarming situation.
It's an alarming situation, and the situation is really deteriorating in Europe. In the case of the Greek journalist, we are still waiting for the investigation to bring some new elements, because at this stage, we still do not know what has happened, whether there is a real link with this profession. But yes, you mentioned Daphne Caruana Galizia, killed in 2017, and Jan Kuciak in 2018, not talking about the number of foiled attacks on Italian journalists covering the mafia and the criminal networks, and not those in Serbia or Montenegro, where journalists are, shot at. We are talking about countries which are looking to enter the European Union. So the situation is not good right now in the European Union. Bulgaria is ranked 112 in our index out of 180 countries, the worst in the whole region, with attacks on journalists, and a number of journalists not able to report in a proper way, or just not being able to get the information and publish them in proper conditions. So Europe is not anymore a place where press freedom is free. There are some good countries like the Nordic ones, but it's the whole deterioration of the press. Only 7% of the countries RSF monitors throughout the world are still in the white zone, the zone where they can do their job in good conditions.
Tom, in Hong Kong and different parts of the world, there's this debate between the need to preserve the human rights and liberties values with respecting the national security issues. But most of the time, the ground seems to be tilting towards the national security matters, which explains why the clampdown will definitely have to continue.
Yeah, well, we see a lot of excuses around Asia, whether it's COVID-19, national security, or so-called fake news, for authoritarians to crack down on the press. Having initially been emboldened to do so from the Trump era, we now see particularly Beijing actually empowering, inspiring, and in some cases literally equipping, countries, small countries like Cambodia, to do so, to censor the internet. And particularly when it comes to fake news, we're seeing potentially this year such a law being rolled out in Hong Kong, according to the city's chief executive, according to the police. And the big question that raises is who decides what is fake? Is it news that is inconvenient to the government? The authorities, certainly in Hong Kong, should not be the arbiters of truth. The media are here to hold the powerful to account. And I would say we are already seeing the authorities trying to fill that role of journalists, with now Chief Executive Carrie Lam appearing on TV 4 times a day, every day, in her own show, interviewing people. And during 2019, we saw the police, picking up microphones and reporting from the front lines of the protests. So it is not for them to be adopting the roles of journalists. under this guise of, combating misinformation.
Mohamed, for quite some time, the biggest challenge facing journalists and freedom of expression was basically the warlords, the fanatics, the dictators who were intent on clamping down on dissent. Now you have leaders elected democratically, but suddenly they have been moving forward towards a populist agenda, and they have become one of the main people at the forefront of the fight and the clampdown on freedom of expression.
Yeah, well, I think here, we would be remiss if we didn't, talk more about Donald Trump. I think his presidency was particularly harmful. As Tom said, he sort of emboldened leaders all throughout the world to take these sort of aggressive stances against the media, right? He was constantly engaging in what Herman and Chomsky called flack, right? Sort of disciplining members of the press, except, the difference with Trump is that he was very explicit, very outward in the way in which he was doing that. There was no subtlety to him. In the United States, there's a long tradition of the government engaging in tactics that manipulate media, right? You can read, for instance, Manufacturing Consent by Herman and Chomsky. They talk about the various filters that exist, their natural structural constraints built into the system in the US. And so we only end up with the news that is, quote, fit to print. But Donald Trump comes along and is basically not even trying to hide his intentions. And he took measures, quite honestly, that went far beyond anything that we had seen in modern American history.
Pauline, the European Council has warned against what it described as systematic attempt to dismantle freedom of expression in Hungary and Poland, which seems to be impressed by the styles of the Hungarian authorities and which seem to be also replicating across the board.
Absolutely. Hungary is actually the country which put in place the first laws, measures to prevent journalists to investigate on the pandemic and threatening journalists with prison sentences for publishing fake news, even though no one knew what exactly were fake news according to the Hungarian government. And the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban is a problem for press freedom because it's also followed by a number of authoritarian leaders. In Slovenia, for example, the new prime minister is also acting in the same way. You mentioned Poland, which is in a very, very worrying state right now, with the Law and Justice Party in power since 2015, and all liberties, all freedom of expression and freedom of the press have sort of disappeared with attacks on the justice. There was one latest one against the ombudsman. It's not anyone, it's the ombudsman of the country. So having such attacks on press freedom and civil liberties in big countries like this has an impact and an effect and consequence on others.
Tom, it's not only the physical threats and attacks targeting journalists. Now governments are using restrictive laws, commercial takeovers, financial regulations to silence journalists. Do you think it's about time to rethink international regulations and laws to put an end to impunity and to protect journalists?
Well, certainly you're seeing ownership issues in Hong Kong, and there has been efforts to sort of self-regulate, I suppose, through the Journalists Association here. But in addition to the security law, you're getting the rise of sort of indirect bureaucratic and legal attacks on the press too. If you look at the case of Bao Choi, a freelancer who was hurled into court for using public records to investigate the police action during a mob attack in 2019, I imagine we're going to see more, imaginative or innovative sort of ways for going after journalists in Hong Kong at the same time as these new laws are coming in to regulate so-called fake news and such. But these are not things, I think, that any authority internationally or here should be seeking to regulate. As I say, they should not be the self-appointed arbiters of truth. It can cause problems, clearly, having press freedom, but it should not be upon governments to be seeking to regulate the distribution of information.
Mohamed, we've got to a point where governments in the Philippines, in India, in different parts of the world, using the emergency laws for COVID-19, are putting into place all sorts of mechanisms and punitive laws that would consider anyone who would dare work out an investigation into what went wrong and accuse him of inciting sedition.
Right. We've seen that in India, in the Philippines. We've also seen it in Latin America. We've seen it in the Arab region, in places like Egypt. And it's not just the issues that you described. It's really simple matters of reporting of facts. When journalists have tried to describe accurately the number of COVID cases, for instance, in particular countries, they've been disciplined. Recently in Egypt, a journalist for The Guardian, so a Western journalist in Egypt, was expelled for contradicting the government narrative on the coronavirus. And another journalist from the New York Times was warned by the Egyptian government. So this is all documented in some recent analyses, including a report that was published recently by Human Rights Watch. So it's very concerning. Governments are using the coronavirus pandemic as an excuse to try and exert greater and greater control.
Pauline, at the same time, we have this report from the United Nations about what it described as an avalanche of misogynistic abuse targeting women journalists worldwide, where social media platforms are the main forum that has been used to spread those attacks targeting women journalists worldwide.
It is true, there is a rise of attacks on journalists on the social networks. And one of the explanations is also that female journalists are also attacked along with their families, their children, very often their daughters. We've seen a number of cases, and these attacks against female journalists are stronger, but not done in the same way as for male journalists. RSF is monitoring the situation, because even in the best countries of our index, the Nordic countries, Sweden, Finland, the Netherlands, all these countries at the top of the index, we see a rise of these attacks. Very famous journalists are just insulted by trolls, anonymous trolls, groups of people using the social networks. And this is extremely worrying. It will also discourage young journalists to do this job.
Tom, from Aldous Huxley to George Orwell, Chomsky and others, the general sentiment was there was always going to be someone there waiting for the moment to put his pressure on the community and to silence those who dare say no to him. But you get a sense that the lines are completely blurred here. We're talking about democratic societies which are colluding with leaders elected democratically to silence people.
You know, I think what you're seeing in Hong Kong right now is a true microcosm of what's happening on the world stage. A rising, increasingly assertive, somewhat authoritarian China versus, the open, more democratic values on the West. We talk about Hong Kong being East meets West, and it's literally playing out on the streets here, and it's worth paying attention to, because the sort of crackdown we're seeing here could happen elsewhere. But at the same time, you are seeing a pushback. Executives from the public broadcaster RTHK have been quitting in protest amid a crackdown there. We here, every day are seeking to respond to this, business and legal advice, moving to a private office, as we've had to do from a co-working space, using encrypted devices, and having an openness with staff about, potential self-censorship. I think everyone is picking a hill to die on, and for a lot of us, it is reporting hard news and getting the news out.
It seems to be a grim reminder of the way we have to go for freedom of expression to thrive in the near future, but it's going to be a commitment from every one of us to continue the fight for the world to be a better place to live in. Pauline, Ades-Mevel, Tom, Grundy, and Mohamed Elmasry, I really appreciate your insight. Thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem, Ahelbarra, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.